glad to be here. I spoke a couple years ago, I believe. I don't know if some of you were at that presentation about the nature of collaboration. And I thought I would expand it this time into more of a traditional artist talk, but with an eye and lens to the concerns I'm interested in. So I'm calling it Gathering Spaces, and I think you'll get that by the end of the presentation. I work in several media. My heart is in printmaking as my launch point, but I pull that into other things, and I'll kind of demonstrate that process over the years in this presentation. I do most of my printing on an etching press, which I have in my garage, which is 2 blocks from here on Chemeketa Street between 14th and 17th. I frequently do open studios in my studio, so I'll let you know if I can get the list. I'll send you things. What compels me to make art for 40 years? Well, these are my primary concerns: curiosity, connection, and community. And I didn't even realize as I was writing that I have these 3 C's, but the alliteration is nice. I have an article for you all about the nature of creativity, which is available up here, that I wrote for The Statesman. And I'm going to preface it with how I prefaced this article. What is creative living? Any life that is driven more strongly by curiosity than by fear. This is a quote from Elizabeth Gilbert. Perhaps you've read her books. She's best known for Eat, Pray, Love, but I think her other books are much better. And she wrote a book on the nature of creativity called Big Magic. So if it's a topic you're interested in, she might be a resource. As I said, I primarily work on an etching press, which means that my work goes through, well, you can come visit me at Salem Art Association, where we have an etching press as well, and I can demonstrate for you. But the plates can be made by any materials and put through a tremendous amount of pressure in a press that allows one to emboss things, that it allows you to work in series and sequence, which is a very important thing for me. This is a piece called 7 Sights. It was, I'm sorry, lost my button here. It was shown at the Bush Barn a couple years ago, and it is a response to a trip to Barcelona, and every layer of the piece is a different instinct or impression I had of Barcelona. It combines metal with wood, and I'm literally printing on the press on wood. So I am kind of a guerrilla printmaker. Traditional printmakers would probably be angry at me because I really push the medium and put alternative materials right through my press. I have a warhorse of a press that I brought from Brooklyn, New York, and it's a little complaining now after all these years, but I do put it through its paces. This shows a close-up of one section, the top being a response to Gaudi's, who's been to Barcelona? Okay, so you remember Park Güell, I'm mispronouncing it possibly, but it's about right, which was just a fantastic place, and every bit of that park is covered with Gaudi's mosaics. The second refers to, if you might remember, the gates of Barcelona, in front of the homes, the metal gates patterns I found there. And the next one is actually counting from, we're at 3 now, 3 symbols, 4 symbols, 5 symbols. So in the entire piece, you count from 1 to 7. Here shows the scale, and I do this a lot where I composite pieces, smaller pieces, 14-inch square wooden pieces into a larger piece. I had the fortune to exhibit with the great late sculptor Rick Bartow in this show, who has passed within the last couple years, but is an Oregon and national treasure. You can see this now at River Gallery. This is called Japanese Stone Gardens, appropriate for being at TIU. We were at TIU in Kawagoe on a teaching situation, and I was very compelled by the stone gardens of Japan. So I set myself a formal problem to take the same 5 forms and work with them to change the space of each piece. Again, I'm working with printing on wood, and in this case, bringing in drawing and carving and painting. Also inspired by Japan, I wanted to teach myself Japanese hanga, or printmaking, which is a very intricate process, so I went there with that ambition. And I soon found out that one has to work with a master to accomplish that, which I later did in Kyoto, but I got really into the wood, so this really started my working on wood as a surface. This was a series of 4 called Shrine, and you can see how you can, through printmaking, change one substrate or template as you go through that process into related but very different work. So this idea of series, sequence, compositing things, text and image, led me to be very interested in books, what we call artists' books, or the book arts. This is a book which is a collaboration with a poet I met at Smith, and much later we worked together. It's made of handmade paper. It's right down here, so you can see it in person. It unfolds to become a seascape and landscape. And the words, the letterpress words, if you know about letterpress printing and handset type, are found between the pages. My intent is that often when I show it back to back, so it's a total circular experience. You have to walk around the book and immerse yourself in these spaces. This is a tunnel book called Crossing Borders from a project in Mexico City. My husband, Mike Nord, works at Willamette, and I think he's spoken to you a couple times as well. He's a musician and sound artist and currently chair of the music department, and is counting the 1 more year he has left to do that. But he and I collaborate quite a bit, and we did a tour in Mexico City where I showed my books and videos, and musicians responded to them. So this was all about the diaspora in Mexico of crossing borders. It was the beginning also of my working with light as a source of both inspiration and material within my work. The idea of artist books being an interactive experience for the viewer is very important to me. So this is a set of kites. They're on kozo, Japanese paper. They actually fly. There's an edition of 125 of these books. And they go through the elements from earth to wind to fire to water to air. And that's also here on the table, so you can see them in person. And I've been in many shows where they are flying. They set up air fans and they fly around, but I'm not convinced anyone purchasing the book is actually flying these, but I wanted it to be possible. And this has letterpress poetry with a longtime collaborator of mine, Melinda Kennedy, who's also passed, and from Northampton, Massachusetts, wonderful poet, great friend. Here's the fire. You can see how the text is incorporated within the kite. She had this great strategy with the words. It's a John Cage technique where she listed the words and then made the stanzas, which live on each kite, or printed on each kite, from that list of words. But the thing that I was so impressed and charmed by was that if you look at the top of the page, it goes from earth, wind, fire, water, air, and then as you go to the bottom, it transitions in the opposite direction. And it's what the book is all about, all the interactions of the elements. So she did that with text just as I did it with imagery. So through that kite book, I got to know the kite community and was in some publications for kite artists and kite people. And so I wanted my next book to also engage me with a community of some sort that was different than my own. So I had spent my youth in India and was always interested in shadow puppet theaters. And so I did my next book, Shadow Play, which is the larger piece on the table here. It's a set of puppets that you can manipulate through a translucent stage There's text and story starters, so the idea is that you would get this book and you would interact those puppets in front of and behind the translucent stage to create story. And I suggest things like creation myths, journey tales, all those things that are the great world stories. The puppets represent points in life. If you go from left to right, you have birth, adolescence, maturity, I'm going to call it middle age, death, and resurrection. So in the traditional shadow puppet theater, that green puppet, sorry, I'm going to go back one. Oh, no, it's not going to work. Oh, well. Okay, we'll just have to remember that last green puppet becomes the can, it's called, and so the shadow puppeteer brings it in when it's in between the stories. And so to me, that really represented a sort of continuity and a resurrection. Oh, there it is. Now it wants to do it. Okay. My latest book, which we just launched at Book Bin last week, the author and I, is called Sacred Spaces. And each of the pages is a pop-out translucent layering, and each of them represent a different sacred site in the world. My intent with this is that you put a light source behind it, within it, and it's a portable object of contemplation. It all folds up into a box that you could take with you on the road. So it's sort of your meditational, however you want to approach it. It's very open, whatever your belief system is, to engage with this piece. So in this piece, the poet got the set of lists that are on the front of the book, and she responded to the place I was describing and that list to write the poems that are on the back of the book. So they're all very much interactive and layered over each other, and you walk around the book and you read different parts. And that's what I like. I ask my viewers to do a little work. Magic things have happened with this book. When I was at Vermont Studio Center last fall, which I'll talk about a little bit when I talk about residencies, I was working on finishing the book, and I walked into my studio, and the light source behind the window was throwing the cross on the piece called The Cross. So this is why I make art. So this idea of taking prints into books, into space, into 3 dimensions was then a natural thing for me to get involved in installation. Many of these installations, you might recognize the places. We were part of a Salem Art Association project space for 8 years, I think. Yeah, Jim? 8 years, and we, my colleague Kathy Dingus and I at Salem Art started this, and every one of those spaces, I think now, is occupied. And so it was art leading to community development, is what I say. So people came in to see this art in these empty Salem spaces, and many people came through, and now, of course, Salem's growing, but we take a little credit for exposing these spaces. This was in what's now Travel Salem, upstairs, previously a bank, and then Roger Yost Gallery, and now Travel Salem. I had 2 rooms. There was a dark room and a light room. This piece is called Healing Forest. And Mike also did a sound piece for this. If you go on my website and go to this piece, you can hear his sound. He took the percolating sound of water and layered it, as he does, to just be this beautiful sense of nature. This is quite large. This actually fills a whole wall, and it's a projection of the symbol I use a lot, which means continuous life. And onto panels I printed from branches that my healing team gave to me. So this was all dedicated to a group of wonderful community members, 8 people who were with me through a second bout of cancer and were my healing team. So I really dedicated this space to them. It's a little hard to see, but in that last panel on the right, it's the print, but it's also the actual branch. So you had the print, the branch, the video, and then in the light room, if you're up in that second floor of that building, it has these wonderful lights you can see from the State Street side, I believe. And so there were the positive prints from the branches filled that room. So this idea of light and dark, something I enjoy. This is now, I think, a gym across from the conference center, as you go down 22 and turn there to get to River Road, Riverfront Road. This was a wonderful space, empty space for project space 1 year. I call it Light Labyrinth. I consider it to be book arts writ large. So I've got scrolls, I've got unfolding accordion books. They're kinetic, they move. And the idea, there's sound and light inside of it. And the idea was that you could enter the space and find the sound, but also experience the pieces. The theme for each of the panels came from oh, excuse me. My husband said, turn away from the mic. Came from a group I work with of dancers and musicians. And I took the theme I saw in their improvisational works and made prints and drawings on these forms. Then it became a stage set in Smith Hall for those dancers. So they could configure it to dance within. They could move them as an interactive part of their dance. I designed the entire thing so it could go into a flight case about this big. Because after it was performed in the Northwest, it went first to Europe, to Zurich, Switzerland, and then it went to Hong Kong and China. Another empty space in what's the Liberty Plaza Mall, and is now another gym. We seem to have a lot of CrossFit places happening in Salem. So this was a response to a trip we took to pick up our daughter in Prague, where she was studying theater, and then drove in the coldest part of the year in January through Central Europe. And it was just about the journey and the ideas of, again, crossing borders of different cultures. We were thinking about science a lot because we went to different museums that had ancient science instruments. And within the smaller space there is installation, which is a large tunnel book with a projection on it. And the sound in this was my daughter's writing. She's a writer, and my husband took so this is a bit of a family affair. My husband took her writing, had the vocal artist at the time at Willamette record it, and then manipulated the sound. So you'd be in the space and you'd hear these words, which were also posted outside the gallery in the previous slide. So concentric forms, circles, you see them coming up in a lot of the work. To me, it is about going through, passing through, coming out, and places of gathering. So this is a piece called Vortices. It was in the bottom floor of the building that's now condos on River Road, across from the Carousel. 2,000 square feet, so it was a challenge for me to fill this space. So what I came up with was that each element of it, which I see as unified through the color and the forms and the materials, also was a separate station. And at each station, I had what I called a cairn, like in hiking where you have a pile of rocks. Well, I had piles of poetry that was printed on the same sepia paper that I had handmade, just as that form, which I call rim, is also handmade paper. So it's basically the entire installation is handmade paper and wire and metal and letterpress printing. So the poet, who I also did Sacred Sites with, Dawn Diaz-Willis, who is a Salem resident, and her recent book was a finalist in the Oregon Book Awards, so another Salem person of great creativity. Her sound of reading these poems went through the whole installation, and again, Mike manipulated it so it became sound, words, and many people told me that as they walked from station to station, that suddenly they heard that poem that they were reading. So that's what I enjoy, is that people were finding, as I said in the beginning, connections. This is a piece called Spiral, and it's actually kinetic. Worked with Barry Buchanan, who used to be an engineer for the city of Salem, and is now a consultant to make the metal piece. If you walk around it, the air that you're moving around it makes it spin, and you see the cairn or pile of poems in front of it. My idea with that piece was when you looked, because the space had light front and back. When you looked from one side, you would see, as in the last slide, the positive, but when you looked from the other side, it would just be a line in space. And that's just paper pulp squirted into metal window screening to create the spiral. So as you see, gathering spaces, community is an ongoing theme. I just feel as an artist that our power and potential is to bring people together, bring ideas together, create safe spaces, and be I don't know, maybe a conduit for exchange of ideas. This is a show I had in La Grande last year called Gathering Spaces. And it happened to coincide with the path of totality. It wasn't my intent. I had gotten the show. Often artists, 2 years in advance, you get the shows, and so you're working towards it. So I didn't really have a eclipse theme, but I think they found it within the pieces. Call this piece Gathering Space Number 1. And for me, it's a collection of figures, ideas, forces, wherever you want to go with that, overlapping, communing, and yet being individuals. It's printed paper that's then been cut into pattern with light projecting through it. It hangs a couple feet out from the wall. The middle piece, probably the most eclipse-like, again, metal, paper, painting, printing. Gathering space number 2. I like floor pieces a lot. I think it's important that we look up and down and across. Across the way is gathering space number 3, and that's a collection of smaller prints that are just configured within 2 pieces of string on the wall. Very important that it had that internal light source in the middle. To me, it was about things transforming, metamorphizing. People, depending on your lens, people see different things in it. People into gardening see seeds, and people into geology see rocks, and botanists see cells. So that's really my joy as an abstract artist, that you can bring to these things what interests you as well. This was a wonderful space. It's called Art Center East, not-for-profit, in a old historic turn of the 20th century library, and the windows were all along the top. So it was very important to me to go to that space and react to it specifically and use that idea of the grid of the windows as part of the work. It's called Intersection. It's, again, a composite print, so each of the prints are individual prints composited into a larger piece. I am so low tech. I make my plates out of cardboard, string, and glue. That's it. And please come and visit me. I'm still artist in residence through this week and next in the Annex Studio at Salem Art Association, and you can see my plates and just see how it's done. I think because I worked with kids for 40 years, I want everything to be accessible to teachers and students and myself, get away from toxic materials, which historically is rampant in printmaking of old, let's say. My next gathering space was in a Bend Art Center. You'll see my forms reemerging. You've seen them a few times. The graphics also relate to the Sacred Spaces book, which was showing there as well. But what's kind of neat that I tried in this one that I hadn't done before is everything's printed on the wall. So at the end of the show, it's water-soluble ink. So you take a sponge and you wash it all off. So you hope to have a very good photograph, which I think this is pretty good. So finally, in my last segment, in the last 10 minutes, I wanted to talk a bit about where I thrive in community, and that is artist residencies. I've had the fortune to be in artist residencies around the world, and just returned from one in Buenos Aires. And they are all configurations, all numbers of artists, all media. They can go from one person, like I am right now at Salem Art, to 55, which has been the largest one I've been to in Vermont. They tend to average between 6 to 12. And sometimes it's just artists, sometimes it's artists and scientists, sometimes it's artists and writers, artists and composers, choreographers, poets. And it just is a wonderful way to have ideas pollinate and exchange, and it's very inspiring. Plus, they're all usually in incredibly interesting, beautiful places. One of those places was Gerasi, which is in Woodside, California. I don't know if you know Carl Gerasi, but he invented the progesterone portion at Stanford of the birth control pill. So he made lots and lots of money, unlike the early pioneers who didn't. But he bought a lot of the Santa Cruz hills, and he made it into an artist colony. And on that site, there are monumental, site-specific sculpture. And then artists in residence are encouraged to leave work in response to the landscape as well. So the first day there, with these residencies, they're highly competitive. You have to have a proposal. Usually you start out, they ask, what are you going to do? And you say, well, you talk about your proposal. Oh, I'm finishing this novel. I'm writing the next play to be performed, blah, blah, blah. So we each have our thing. But what was great at Gerasi is we did the round robin of our ambitions for that month or 6 weeks. And the director said, okay, now throw it all out the window. You can do that, but you can also just sit in your room, walk in the woods, heal, whatever feeds you as an artist. And that gave us great permission. I think we all did our projects, but we had permission not to. And I think it's rare that we are kind of here now. And I felt so inspired. So what I did the first week I was there, I did get to my book, but the first week I walked the hills and I responded to the monolithic sculptures with found objects. I responded to the landscape of the hills and the ocean, and I did a series of work. This is just 1/3 of it, and I called it Tabletop Gerasi, so someone could come in and see all these Gerasi in book form. And it was playful and fun, and it's very important for artists to remember a sense of play. In another response to a place, this is Colors of Buenos Aires. It's my latest body of work. I just returned in August, so I'm pretty fresh. I went to this, who's been to Buenos Aires? It's a pretty amazing city. And if you remember La Boca, which is the wharf area, known for the birthplace of tango and street art, this was a tribute to Quintela Bonito Martin. And he was a turn of the 20th century artist who came to this working class wharf community of Italian immigrants right on the mouth of the river, which is La Boca, and just revitalized everything. Street art flourished, tango was born, he had a museum and an art school, and it was his home. So now it is still his home museum and a gallery museum, and you can walk through it. So it's all these little rooms of pattern and color, and a lot of Northwest artists do upcycling of things. It's sort of a form I particularly noticed coming from East Coast to West Coast, recycled art. Well, he was a pioneer in that. His telephone had 3 patterns and colors. His bed had 6 colors. So wandering through the labyrinth of his home is what inspired this piece. Buenos Aires is also on the water, but highly architectural, a real mix of barrios and neighborhoods and cultures. And so I did this piece called Flow, which to me integrates architectural space with natural elements. It's a double accordion, so this is now in the, I sold it right upon returning to Baylor University in Waco, Texas. So I have to make another one now. This was just a one of a kind. This piece, my last gathering place so far, may become something really large. I'm off to Playa Summer Lake in November and December, which is a stark landscape, and I'm thinking maybe it's time to make another large piece there. There it is for scale. This was my opening in Buenos Aires, and you see that I'm in a print shop. There were 2 of us in that print shop, and it was really fabulous. But now I'm at Salem Art, and here's our print shop, and you can see the press. Have people been into the annex area at all? Well, I invite you to come. I'm there through this week and through next. You can see some of this work. I have sort of an ongoing display up, and I also have a piece on the press where you can see my printing process, and I'm always happy to demonstrate. This shows the connection piece. This is in the show at Salem Art. But you see the painting on the wall is an older set of paintings from a couple years ago now I call Travel Stories. And they're actually ink and gouache on handmade paper, so they're one-of-a-kind paintings, nothing to do with printmaking. But then I took those patterns and made plates and printed them and made books from them. So again, that's this continuity, creating a community of work that relates to each other. Extended it through next week because my downtown gallery / studio on State Street flooded the other day. Through the ceiling, it's still flooding. So I've extended my stay at Salem Art for a week. They were gracious enough to house me next week. This is actually a magic photograph of my home studio, which is, if some of you have been there, really just a double-car garage, long, narrow space. But Dennis Galloway was here. He's now in the Southwest, but he did these amazing series of Oregon artists in their studios with this multiple exposure thing where he stood in one space and he moved around and then used the concave lens and created. So I just loved ending with it because it does sort of make this pretty pedestrian garage gallery into sort of a cathedral of art. So that's my presentation. Oh, no, I have one more thing. I have the end piece here. So if you're interested, again, this article is up on the dais. And so this is how I ended this article. Why live the creative life? I return to the initial inspiration of this musing. To live the creative life is to put curiosity beyond fear. Curiosity to explore the unanswerable questions. Curiosity to find the light. Curiosity to see how a process evolves. Curiosity to see how an experiment resolves. Curiosity drives us to begin again and learn again and create again. So now I know if there's any questions or comments.
And question over here.
Okay.
Here, Joel. Very inspiring, very moving presentation today. My question is kind of pedantic. In terms of process, what kind of wood do you use for the panels? Is it just plywood, pressed wood, and then how do you put it all together into a big wall piece? Okay, so Velcro is a big material used. I use Luan, I use plywood. In certain things you have to have a very specific wood, like Japanese woodcut, you have to have a grain that works a certain way. But since I'm using the wood primarily as a working surface, as a plate becomes the piece kind of thing, it's not necessary to invest in really heavy or hard to find woods. But yeah, the piece at Bush Barn, the large piece, Velcro. And what's great about that is then you can remove it and I can put it into frames, which also I do with Velcro. So, the panels and paper, of course there's other materials used, but in terms of wood, that's the answer. A sort of funny thing with that is the pieces you saw, the shrine piece. I went to the 100 yen store in Kawagoi, which is the equivalent then to the dollar store, 100 yen. And they had shelving pieces that they were selling, and I used those. That was the base of those pieces. Sometimes I use wood veneer from wood crafters, larger pieces, thinner wood.
My name is Carmen, and I was wondering if you had ever done settings for stage settings, but I've watched the finale of So You Think You Can Dance, and a group did a circle dance, and they also used props that made different designs, and they would get some wonderful ideas from you. So I was very impressed that this all fit together from this last week, and then your discussion on your circles.
Well, were you here for the stage set I showed with the dancers in it?
No, I was late because I have trouble walking.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there's actually a stage set in the presentation, and it was performed here at Willamette and then in Europe and Asia. But those pieces folded up and were put into different settings. I know in Zurich, the stage of that, I don't get to go on these trips, I send my work off. But the seating was above, and so folks saw that these were suspended, but in that situation, they couldn't hang anything. So they actually put them on the ground and danced within them and picked them up and manipulated them. There was a lot of freedom for them just to improvise with the pieces. So very related to what you're talking about. I'll have to stream that.
I'm amazed at all your art. I mean, it's just lovely. Thank you for coming. But I just wonder why, I mean, you must have someone to help you organize everything.
I'm a type A. And my husband calls himself the schlepper. So when we move a lot of things, I heavily depend on him, because at this point, his back's better than mine.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It's really expansive to people that have mostly been raised in science. And then I'd like to ask, have you been to or shown at the Joseph E. Art Center in Joseph, Oregon? I know you got as far as LeGrand. Did you make it on up to Joseph?
I have been to Joseph. I knew of their work in terms of cast bronze, but I'm sure Joseph has changed. I haven't been there for many, many years, so I'll check that out. Yeah, thank you for the suggestion.
This is Anne. I'm a novice at this art. I can look at it and appreciate it, but I don't know really how you do it. Could you walk us through one small project and tell us what you do?
Book, the recent book. Let's see. No. So in this case, I would have made. Can you hear me doing this? Okay. So in this case, there's about 5 strips of paper. Yay long. I would make a variety of plates with glue and other collage materials on cardboard. Then I would seal that cardboard so it becomes resistant to, because I have to ink it, I have to wash it. So you seal it with something like a Krylon clear spray. So then it becomes almost like plastic. Then I would run those strips of paper through my press, and they'd print texture on the paper. So then, basically, I'm very good at accordioning paper. It's called the concertina fold in book arts, and I'm just a good folder. So I would fold all these pieces up, and in this book, really, it's just, kids making fans kind of idea, but you cut 2 of them and intersplice them. It's called a slit concertina. So basically, all I'm doing is taking these folded prints I have made and then interacting them by cutting one and cutting the other and putting it together. There it is. Did that help? I am teaching a class. The literature's up here at Salem Art in November. So if you want to have a hands-on experience, I'm a good teacher, so I take you from the real basics, and suddenly you're making something fairly elaborate, and you can't believe you did it.
So we have time for a few more questions, but we do want to reserve a little bit of time so you can go up and look at Anne's pieces in the front here.
Hello, this is Priscilla. And I found this very inspiring, and I loved hearing about what you did in different residencies, and I'm curious to know what you did in Vermont.
So I was at Vermont Studio Center, which is in the Northeast Kingdom, almost to, it's Johnson, Vermont. There's a university there as well. Vermont Studio Center is the largest residency I've ever been to. They have 55 international artists, half visual artists and half writers. They also have translators, so often they would have like a Chinese poet coming with their Canadian translator, and this would be a place for them to meet and work together. I worked on and resolved and finished the Sacred Spaces book, which is here. And that was my project there, that I showed you the picture of the cross coming through it. But I also did the piece I later printed in Bend. I did the prototype for that because I had that show coming up. I didn't do it on the wall there, I did it on paper, so it was a little different, but I planned that piece there. So
Sharon?
it was lovely. I mean, I don't know, I think in a way I relate best to writers versus other artists sometimes. I'm verbal, I guess.
Sharon, I noticed you did some sound a little bit in your presentation, and about 14 years ago I went to the Disney Hall, the home of the LA Philharmonic, and they did a whole concert on with paper. And I thought, boy, that fits right into what you're doing.
Okay,
and
I'm going to take your idea and propose it to my husband. So.
All right, if there aren't any more questions, I think we'll adjourn. Oh, we do have a question here from Jinx. Sorry, Jinx, don't hurt me.
And you are just wonderful and prolific. I almost wept when you said you washed it off the wall. Oh my gosh.
I always say art, and this is why I did, after I had a child, I did the Airborne book, because I always say art is kind of like kites and children. You just have to let them go.
Okay.
And hopefully you share it with people along the way, and maybe
well,
someone has it in their home.
Then my next question has to do with what, if your work hasn't found another home, what do you do with all of what you have? Do you keep it? Do you get rid of it? Do you say, well, okay, done with this, on to something else, and you recycle it? I mean, do the folks with the blue bin get your contributions? What do you do?
Well, and, in grad school, there was a little bit of that happening in the conversation about, if you live a long art life, what do you do? And there's different philosophies. Some people, destroy their work and say, that's done, I'm done with that. But I'm not of that philosophy, and I work with paper, so it's pretty easy to store. And the other piece of that is what's old to me is new to you. So I have many exhibitions that are sort of retrospective, and people resonate with work that for me was a while ago, but for them it's new and they love it. And so I continue to mix it up when I show work. I show old and new together. So I'm thinking now, because of this flooding studio, of doing a last first Wednesday in October and maybe a studio sale, because I think I have to get out of that space. So if you want reduced art, come on down, State Street, Abbey Art Center. Does that answer?
It does. And you are a treasure to us here in Salem. We are so grateful for your time. Thank you.